Hi, I'm really happy to have you here on epidemiologist.com with Prof. Desirée Van der Heijde to talk about the measurement instruments and the step for developing a disease activity score. We choose as an example the ASDAS score.
I'd like to present to you how to develop a disease activity measurement and to validate it. And I will use the example of the ankylosing spondylitis disease activity score. I'm Desirée Van der Heijde. I'm a professor of rheumatology and working at the Leiden University Medical Center in the Netherlands. These are my disclosures. You are used to see all the pharma companies, they are listed here. But I think in this context, it is important to tell you that I'm the developer of the ASDAS, where there is no copyright and no royalties fee, so I don't earn any money with it. These are the two important references. First is about the development of the disease activity score, and the second one about defining the cutoff values. If you think about disease activity, it's something you cannot really measure. It's a kind of a construct. And you have different assessments which try to measure this construct of disease activity. And all these single assessments, they measure a part of the construct. But combining several instruments into one score will increase the validity of the score and also enhance the discriminative capacity and the sensitivity to change. And I will show you this in the example of the ASDAS. But the prerequisite is that the assessments measure a different aspect of the construct of disease activity and are not redundant. I can show you this in an animation. So assume that this is disease activity. If you have a single assessment that's measuring a part of disease activity, the second one, a different part. So if you would add this information, you have more information about disease activity. Adding this one also helps, and also this one. But if you add this one as a single measure, it is very important to measure disease activity. But if you have already those other 4 instruments in your composite score, this one is redundant and should not be added. Another example is, for example, function, which is not really part of the construct of disease activity. There are various steps in development of a disease activity score. The first one is that you have to develop, it doesn't work, doesn't continue. Let's see.
You have to...
Yeah, now it does. Okay. Start over again. You have various steps in the development of a disease activity score. First, you have to select the candidate single variables instruments that could be included in a disease activity score. Thereafter, you define the groups of patients with high and low disease activity by an external construct. So for the ASDAS, we used patients who were considered to be candidates for the start of a TNF blocker. Those were the patients with high disease activity, and those who did not start with a TNF blocker was the group with low disease activity. Thereafter, you have to do a form of data reduction because you have many single variable instruments. You cannot take them into account all together. So therefore, you do first a principal component analysis, and you get several factors, for example, 5 factors, and the different variables load on those factors. Thereafter, you discriminate the 2 groups of high and low disease activity by a discriminant function analysis by using those factor loadings. Thereafter, you do a linear regression analysis of the individual discriminant score to get back the loading of the single variables. And by doing so, you obtain a formula with the variables. Thereafter, you have to validate these candidate formulas in independent cohorts. And finally, you want to define also thresholds of status and improvement. And again, you have to validate also these thresholds. These were the single variables parameters that came out of the first steps in the development of the ASDAS. And thereafter, we got a formula, and we have two different formulas. One is when using CRP, and the other one when using ESR. So you see that there is a different weighting of the individual components, and this gives you thereafter the total score. You can also calculate what is the rating of one variable when you would start with just that variable. And in the example of the ASDAS, they have almost an equal weight in the formula, even though you would not tell this from the formula that you see here. In the validation, you have to compare the new disease activity score with an existing disease activity score and with single assessments. So here you see the Pearson correlations in an independent cohort with the patient global and the physician global. To compare, you see also the relationship between physician global and patient global, which is very low in axial SPA. And that's not only in this cohort, but in every cohort you see this. So this is important that the new disease activity measures has a good relationship with both patient and physician global assessment. And you see that the ASDAS is better performing than the BASDAI. If you then also compare to individual components, you see that the ASDAS and the BASDAI, they are better than the individual components. Another important aspect is the discrimination. To do this, you can take trial data. Here we used TNF data after 3 months of treatment in comparison to placebo. You can calculate the standardized mean difference, the higher the better, a t-score again, and also the guide's effect size, which is an effect size calculated based on the improvement in the active group minus the placebo group divided by the standard deviation. And the guide's effect size above 1 is already good, so 2.4 for the ASAS CRP is really a very high effect size. If you then also calculate this for the single variables, you see that these are all lower, but it is also remarkable that the entire BASDAI, you get similar effect sizes if you use only one of the questions of the BASDAI, indicating that the BASDAI has redundant information in it. The next step was the definition of the cutoffs. They are important both in clinical trials and in clinical practice. And we decided to have relevant cutoffs for disease activity states and also improvement scores. There you can use receiver operating curve analysis, and then you have to use external constructs, and that's really important. So for the discrimination between inactive and moderate disease activity, we use 3 different criteria: partial remission criteria, the patient global and physician global assessment below 10. If you thereafter want to have the cutoff between moderate and high disease activity, we use the cutoffs you see, and also between high and very high disease activity. I have to indicate when we developed the ASDAS, we called it moderate disease activity. Later on, this name was changed into low disease activity. This also published in a separate letter by Pedro Machado. And then also you need to have external criteria to define a cutoff for being better. Here we decided to have a minimally important improvement and also define a major improvement. And we had a questionnaire for the patients if they were much better, unchanged, worse, or much worse than the previous visit. So we could use the external. This resulted in the next cutoff for the disease activity states, having inactive disease between 1.3, low disease activity 1.3 to 2.1, etc. And we also defined the cutoffs for change scores, And we finally called the minimally important improvement the clinically important improvement, which is an improvement of at least 1.1 and a major improvement of at least 2. Later on, we also developed separately a clinically important worsening. And you see also that the worsening and improvement does not result in the same value, and that's usually the case. Thereafter, you also have to validate these cutoffs. So here we compared the ASDAS change of at least 1.1 versus the ASAS 20, the BASDAI 50, or a change in BASDAI of at least 2. Again, in the same trial that I mentioned before. Here you can calculate the chi-square, and the higher this chi-square is, the better the discrimination is. And we also calculated the number of patients needed per group to have an 80% power in a clinical trial with two-sided testing. And you see that if you use the ASDAS in comparison to, for example, the ASAS 20, you really have fewer patients needed with the same power. We did a similar thing for the ASDAS major improvement, and also here, if you compare to the ASAS 40, you need only half of the patients. This is an important also kind of construct where you see that inflammation, and that's what we measure with the disease activity score, has direct effect on function and also on structural damage. So to know if the disease activity score is really a representation of inflammation, you also have to show that link as a kind of validation step. Here is an important work from Sofia Ramiro, where you see that the ASDAS is related to a progression in the ASAS. So with an increase of an ASDAS of 0.72, there is an increase of 1 in the ASAS in 2 years. So that means that you really have a relationship with the development of syndesmophytes. And also the various steps of disease activity states also gives a direct relationship. And here you see how much that relationship is if you compare the various aspects of the disease activity states. We also assess the relationship between the ASDAS and work productivity. This was done in the ASAS, in the space cohort in Leiden. And you also see that there is a very clear relationship between the various classes of ASDAS and the work productivity. And another way of validation is the ASAS Health Index, which is a kind of quality of life measure specific for actual SPA. And you also see here that there is a good discrimination. And also, if you relate it to the ASA 36, an increase of 1 unit in ASDAS has a 9.5 improvement in the ASA 36. The next step, of course, is to make it easier to implement the score, because you can never calculate those formulas. So therefore, we developed the ASDAS calculator. You just need to enter the various scores and then you get the final result. You know in which category it is, and also if it's improvement, then you can also see how much the improvement was, if it's clinically or relevant or a major improvement. And if you don't have a phone or another tablet to calculate, you can always do it on paper and have this paper form, which makes it very easy to calculate. So I think in conclusion, the ASDAS is a way to develop, validate a disease activity measure, and also to help further implementation, both in clinical practice and in research. Thank you for listening.
I have really good feedback from our first interview from a young rheumatologist who told me, is it Professor Désirée Van der Heijde from the score of Désirée Van der Heijde? I say yes. It's the same. Okay.